觉得我要的。
Hello.
Oh, hello.
Good morning, everyone. Happy New Year.
Morning. Happy New Year.
Good evening.
Good evening, I'm sorry. Thank you.
Benji, I see I need to add myself to the list of attendees here. Take care of that.
Yeah.
I was just going to drop in and give a quick update before the TSC meeting.
Sounds good.
everybody.
Hey.
Morning, good evening.
Hey,
Good to see you at one of these, Brian.
Yeah. I was actually just wanted to drop in. I didn't put myself on the agenda, but I can do that. Wanted to give a quick update to folks on what we talked about the upgrade on the docs, the specification docs from V4 to V5.
Sweet. Attendee list is also pretty small today, which I'm not that surprised. Early January, 1st of the year. So if we do have something that we need to take a vote on from TSC, we might need to run that virtually.
Yeah, I think we ought to run it virtually anyhow, because that way we've got the a nice easy paper trail for the results.
how are we doing that, Brian?
So just I guess before we get the meeting started, I can just give a quick overview. Basically, I was talking to Scott Nicholas here at the Linux Foundation, who's the attorney who helped get everything set up here for the Spec membership agreement. And basically, we are on the V4 version of the JDF documents. That's the specification membership agreement that everybody has to sign. And as it turns out, the V4 version of the documents requires a vote and actually a signed document from all contributors for every release, which is something we've been trying to avoid. The idea was, we sign it once and then everything's good to go from there on. The V5 documents, which were developed after GraphQL was set up and after JDF was, integrated into the Linux Foundation, they don't have that. You basically sign the membership agreement once, and then that's good for all future releases. The bad news is it's the documents change. The good news is that there's an upgrade provision built into the existing documents. So the TSC just basically needs to vote. So we'll do that over email. Generally, for other projects, it's easier to run these types of votes over email, because then you can track who still needs to vote and so forth. So just I wanted to give everybody a heads up that was coming.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah. If we don't have critical mass, though, it's probably better if I just send out an email anyhow. So I can also drop that into the meeting minutes here, Benji. So I'll open up a PR and basically summarize what I just said.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Good to have people informed. While we wait for the last few folks to trickle in, I'm merging any pull requests that pop up. All right, attendee list looks pretty stable, so we can get started. I have merged some last minute PRs, so if you got the agenda up, give it a reload so you've got the latest one. And welcome everybody to the first working group meeting of 2021. Hopefully 2021 is an uphill climb rather than a downhill descent into madness. And this group remains a nice thing to do every month. It's always good to talk shop with all of you and make progress on things. So I hope that continue to be that for the rest of you. As always, we start off with a reminder that By participating here, we agree to the membership agreement, participation guidelines, and code of conduct. There are links for all of those in the agenda if you want a reminder of what those are. And then let's just go through everybody really quick, put names to faces. I think everybody here is a familiar face, but always good to just have a good video record of who's here. I have come up with a much simpler sort in the agenda list for this year, which is my name stays on top, and then all other names below that, I just sort my last name alphabetically. So hopefully that makes it easier to know when to introduce yourself, which puts James above me. James.
Yep. Hey everybody, James Baxley, Director of Engineering at Apollo.
Hi, I'm Alan. I work for IBM Research, interested in GraphQL management, and I also maintain the open API to GraphQL library.
Mike Cohen, work for Indeed. We're doing lots of things with GraphQL and interested in how the spec is progressing and how I can help.
Hi everyone, I'm Benji. I maintain the GraphQL suite of tools, and I'm also interested in various tasks on the GraphQL spec itself.
Hi, my name is Ivan, and I hope to maintain GraphQL.js and some other foundation projects.
Hi, I'm Evan. I work on GraphQL at Shopify.
I don't think Mark is here yet.
Okay. I'm after Mark. I'm Matt. I'm at Facebook working on GraphQL on the client side.
Rob, working at First Dibs, been working on the defer and stream spec proposal.
Dan is also not here yet.
This is Brian. I think I'm next. I'm with the Linux Foundation. I help support both GraphQL Foundation as well as the GraphQL project. And I'm here to talk a little bit about some changes to the GraphQL specification membership agreement.
I also realized that I think I have some people in here twice, which is probably my fault when I did the alpha sort. So sorry for that. I'll clean that up. Thanks, everybody. Great to see all of your faces in the new year. Do we have good note-taking? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Andy.
Sorry, I joined a little bit late. I sent you a PR with my entry. Yeah, hi, I'm Andy. Working on GraphQL Java and also working for Atlassian. Yeah, hey everybody.
Sorry to have skipped over you, Andy. Glad you're here. It looks like we have our standard note champion, Benji, already organizing the notes. Mark had mentioned that he would be able to help take notes. He's not here yet. In the case that Benji is engaged in discussion, is anybody willing to volunteer to be note-taking backup?
I can do that.
Awesome, thank you, Evan. Okay, let's take a look over the agenda. We are going to review the previous meeting's action items, then look at advancing no introspection at root of subscription operation, which is a mouthful, but Benji will explain that, I'm sure. Discuss schema coordinate spec, the default coercion updates, default value coercion update, and one advancement in the query ambiguity discussion, and then updates on the defer and stream proposal. Anything else we want to cover on the agenda today that's not already listed here?
Hi, yeah, I added a small item about the meeting time. We can maybe talk about alternative to alternate sometimes the start time of this meeting or so. That's maybe a little bit more friendly to people in other parts of the world.
Completely warranted. Yes, I see that. I'm merging your pull request in now. That added that. Thank you for that. I think I see. We had a couple late additions, so I think anybody who's here who didn't get a chance to introduce themselves, feel free to do so on merging these extra pull requests.
I think I'm one of those. This is Morris here from IBM.
Welcome, Morris. I just saw your pull request, Morris. Thank you. Merge that one in too. Maybe because. All right, here we go. Great. Those should all be in. Thank you. Okay. With that, let's move to action items. Benji, did you do any magic organization for us this time around?
Yeah, I think we can continue on the same pattern as last time. Hopefully not as many items this time. So if we just have a look at the items that are marked ready for review, and I guess if we start with the oldest of those, and I want is open. There we go. Okay, so we'll take the introspection shortcuts RFC. We mentioned that we would be closing this issue during the next working group if no further progress was noted. There is no further progress noted. I suggest we close this issue. 425.
Agreed. I'll close it.
Oh, sorry.
Double close. Look at that.
Double close. There we go. Eventually consistent.
In GitHub.
Okay, then we've got from July, we've got giving feedback on defer and stream and moving the deprecated directive. So giving feedback on defer and stream, I think that was assigned to you, Lee, to give your feedback on it, and I believe you have done so. So feel free to go ahead and close that. That's 508.
Done.
And then the other one is 507, moving the deprecated directive on input fields RFC to stage 2. It is merged and it's RFC 1, so I'm not sure what the status of that is exactly.
Is this? I'm trying to remember what this was in reference to. Oh, I see. You've got a link there at the bottom.
Yeah.
Considering it was merged, this one is done, and we probably just did not do good bookkeeping of updating the tags. So I will update the tags here to make it less confusing. Oh, it looks like yeah, this was just a mistake in tag editing back when we were reviewing this. But since it is merged, actually, you know what? I'm gonna double check this after the meeting. So I'm gonna leave this one open on me just to double check that nothing else weird happened. I'm like 95% confident that this can be closed, but let me review this afterwards.
Absolutely. Sounds reasonable. And then we're up to November. There was a task for give feedback on the schema coordinates suggested GraphQL spec appendix, which was on Mark. I'm not sure if Mark's here yet. Doesn't seem to be.
He's not here yet, but he did mention that this seems ready for review.
Yeah.
Yeah, this one was on Mark because we only wanted to assign it to one person, but it's really on everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there was really good discussion about this in the last 2 working groups, and I suspect Mark will show up a little bit later because he does have something on the agenda, where we'll continue to discuss. So I think this is safe to close as well.
Okay, do you want to close that?
Yep.
Lovely. And then December, we've got 2. We've got 564, which is complete GraphQL.js implementation of subscription introspection validation rule. Oh, this is on me. I have done this and I've actually added it as a topic to discuss during this working group. So we will be discussing this. So we can, I think it's okay to close this. We can open another one if more work is necessary.
Sounds good.
Do you want me to close that or?
Go for it.
Yeah,
Your assigned
cool.
task.
And then the other one is to convene a meeting of the GraphQL Input Unions Working Group. Hey, everyone, there's going to be a meeting of the GraphQL Input Unions Working Group on the 21st of January at 7 p.m. UTC. Details of it are in Slack. You can also find out more about it in this issue, which is 565 on the working group repo. It's also linked on the agenda for this meeting as well. I believe that's done.
Excellent.
Lovely. Okay, so that's just the one that you are ready to, that you'll be looking at again. Does anyone else have any other action items that they feel can be closed at this point?
Let's see. Taking off the ready for review label. Looks like there's a couple at the bottom here that are all assigned to me that I'm going to make a note to resolve those today after the meeting. So those are definitely still open. Just about GitHub infrastructure. There's the one that I left open.
Yeah, there is one open for me. I don't clearly see like a number. It's schema validation to GraphQL.js that enforce deprecation. On nose, yeah. So like I still need to do spec edits, but it was added to GraphQL.js and even released like a long time ago.
So I think this is ready for closing. I'll go ahead and close that.
Great.
Ivan, did you manage to make any progress on the sending notices to the GraphQL.js contributors?
No, I need like, I actually figure out like how to dump the list. I decided not to do it on holidays because like not to overburden like inbox. After holidays, I will send it to everybody, and we already discussed a format, so it's like soft ping saying like, do you want to contribute or not? So it's not like, yeah.
Lovely.
Trying to remember the context of this one. I'm pulling it up in the notes. So this was about just managing the number of committers.
Yeah, because we have like there is like a bunch of people, and there is like even people who never contribute anything, like mostly from Facebook, and even some non-Facebook contributors who like stopped contributing like years ago. So idea is like a soft notice asking like, do you want to still contribute or not? And please respond in like 1 month if you're interested in continue contributing. And if you responded in 1 month, like basically if you not respond in 1 month, or if you say I'm not interested in just to remove these people, you know, from safety point of view and like help to manage like contributors.
That makes sense. I'm thinking in retrospect on this one that if someone is not showing up to contribute, then it seems that they might also not respond to messages. And so we might speed this up by just proactively calling that list, and we can always add people back to the list if they decide they want to come back with like if someone who's a previous contributor who had commit rights shows up later with a pull request and wants commit rights, we can just give them back commit rights. So I'm totally comfortable doing this without reaching out first.
But I think like just to be more positive, we're not losing anything. Like we just prolong the process for 1 month. We have these contributors for like years. So like I feel like we can ask them first.
Okay. Well, how about this? If this issue is, or this action item is still open in next meeting, then we'll just kind of do the fast way. Just because I don't want it to drag on. But I agree with you. All right, does that take us through all of the actions?
I believe so.
I think the rest are all open still. Great. Okay, let's move on. So first up is Benji. Let's talk about advancing the no introspection route of subscription operation.
Do we, are we happy? Does Brian want to talk at this point? Brian added his note quite late. I think it's made its way to the top of the agenda.
Yes. I dropped in a summary of what I said at the very beginning here. But just for anybody who may have missed it, one of the things which we found when we were planning the spec release at the tail end of last year was the current version of the documents that we're using for the GraphQL specification membership. They required a substantial amount of overhead because we need to get signatures every time we want to cut a release from everybody who contributed. That would be pretty unworkable. And it turns out that one of the things that happened when JDF was absorbed into the Linux Foundation, or as part of the Linux Foundation family, was that we changed the documents, we revved them up to V5, and that includes removing that requirement where everybody needs to sign a document every time you do a release. The process of upgrading from V4, which is what GraphQL is currently on, to V5 is fairly straightforward. It's just a vote by the TSC. Once I get those documents, which I'm expecting them hopefully today or tomorrow, I'll send them out to the TSC for review so that they can vote, and we can remove that requirement of chasing people down for signatures every time there's a release. So it's kind of unilaterally a good thing. It's just something that we need to get done. And that's my update.
Thanks, Brian. I'm sure everyone will agree to that. But out of interest, is that like a majority vote, or is it everyone needs to agree on the TSC?
I'll have to look. I think it's a majority or a supermajority vote, but I'll have to actually look and see. I don't recall.
Okay, no worries.
Generally, for something like this, though, just as a matter of practice, I do try and chase everybody down and get a vote from everybody. You know, not because it's required, just because it's good to make sure that everybody has read through it and is, you know, feeling that they understand it well enough to vote on it. So heads up, I'll be chasing you down.
Thanks for doing that.
You're welcome.
I suspect the Slack TSC channel and an email simultaneously is probably the best way to cast a wide net. All right, cool, Benji. We can move on to you to talk about subscription introspection.
Yeah, okay, lovely. So we discussed this last working group that the type name's not valid at the subscription route. We discussed why that might be, whether we wanted to make things different and allow it anyway. There was a mixture of opinions, but we've decided that the most simple route forward right now is to disallow it, since it already doesn't work in the reference implementation. And then we could open up the spec in future to allow additional fields, or define what that would mean for there to be an introspection field at the root of the subscription. So to progress this, I have I've edited the spec pull request, which I think is pretty simple. It's like, yes, seven lines added. So very small edit. And I have written a pull request to GraphQL.js that implements the change. In doing so, I think I discovered that the GraphQL.js validation of this previous requirement may not work quite right when it comes to fragments. And I think that's something that someone else has already noted as well. So I actually ended up having to do quite significant changes to the validation structure within GraphQL.js. I have then added quite a few additional tests to GraphQL.js to ensure that everything's working the way that it should be. So I think I'm just waiting on Ivan to review that. But I think that it could be bumped up a level RFC wise.
Definitely, especially since the spec change itself is quite terse, then you definitely have the PR open. It looks, the JS one, there's definitely a lot of work happening here. I guess there's just lots of arguments in these. There's some recursion happening. So it's definitely not trivial. Deserves a thorough review.
Yes, absolutely.
But it definitely looks comprehensive. Looks like you got a bunch of tests. I feel very comfortable moving this to stage 2. Anybody agree or disagree with that?
Yeah,
Matt's
so
given a thumbs up on video.
Yeah, so everything looks good. The only thing I found during review, I give a quick look, recursion. We need to address it, and yeah, it's non-trivial. Maybe we even need to figure out some generic mechanism for that, because we have like similar issue when we check for overlapping things, overlapping fields. But like spec-wise, I think changes are sound, especially since we don't closing a door on allowing type names, allowing type name on every level. I'm interested in that change, but like I totally agree that first we need to level a plain field. We need to make like specs sound, and then discuss like allowing type name at root level.
Sounds right to me. Great. We'll move this up to stage 2. And the next actions on this are one for Yvonne to give you that more thorough review and see if there's any structural change needed with that pull request. And then also an action on me to do any editorial review of the spec change. But at first read, it looks right. So I think this should be relatively brief, and hopefully we can wrap this one up pretty soon. Thanks for your work on this, Benji.
Yeah, no worries. It's one of the smaller things, which has been nice.
All right. Any other questions or thoughts on that? Otherwise, we can move on. Cool. Let's move on to, I think Mark is still not here, so maybe we'll skip over the schema coordinate spec in the chance that he arrives late. And with that, Benji, you've got the one after that, so we'll just let you keep on going and talk about default value coercions.
Yeah, so the default value coercion we discussed again last spec working group. As a summary of this, it seems that if you have these, sorry, I'm not sure if you can see my my webcam feed, but if you have various queries that I've outlined in the spec pull request 793, which I'll send a link into the chat, that all of those look like they should return the same result, but that doesn't actually seem to be the case. And that is basically because the default values on arguments and input object fields are treated as, I guess, pre-baked. We just use them verbatim. What that means is, though there is some basic validation that's done on them, the validation itself is not sufficient to actually enforce the guarantees that GraphQL would like to enforce. So we check that the objects can coerce to the targeted types. But if we've got something like a default value on one of the fields, and we don't specify that field in the parent default object, then that field might be omitted, in which case it's going to be seen as null, which might break a not null requirement, for example. So there are things where this goes wrong. But also, more broadly, I would just say that it doesn't meet the expectations of people who see what it means. If you see a default is equal to the empty object, you would assume that passing the empty object to that field would give you the exact same behavior. And that is not the case currently. It turns out that this is actually semi-complicated to solve due to the way that GraphQL works and due to where the defaults are actually implemented. In the spec at the moment, we just use the default object directly. We don't do enough checking on it. What I have proposed with this spec pull request is that we actually do effectively runtime coercion of the default object, though I have noted that that can be memoized. And I've written up the spec and factored in the feedback from last month, but the main issue that I have at the moment is that there is a situation where you could define default values in such a way that an infinite loop could occur. And I do not know how best to write into GraphQL spec language that shouldn't be allowed. So at the moment, I've just said, do not allow an infinite loop, but we really need to fill that out with actual spec language. And that is something that I'm struggling with. I've outlined that in this specific comment. So help with solving that particular problem would be welcome. And then once we've managed to get that spec language in place, the next thing to do would be to actually build an initial implementation of this for the reference implementation, assuming that we decide that this is something that we want to fix rather than just, we could try patching it by just tweaking the actual validation that we do on the default object and just say, this is a artifact of how GraphQL was defined, and put up with the fact that passing an empty object and setting the default to be an empty object is different. It's not, I think we should change it, but it is a breaking change, I think, subtly.
Yeah, this one is tricky because this is literally the reason why we avoided exactly the kind of thing that we're proposing adding now. The last time we discussed default values, which was a few years ago, where the intent was anytime you saw a value, that value would be fully formed, and it avoids this case where things expand out in this way. But as you pointed out, there are already cases where this can already be problematic with existing GraphQL queries. So this one's tricky. As you've been digging into this, Benji, where's your head been going at this?
So the way that I see it is that when we build the schema, we can at that point populate the default values and actually like treat them as if they were provided at runtime, but have a value that we then use, like memorize it effectively. But I think we definitely need to have effectively two values. We need to have the default value that the developer specified, and then the digested default value that applies all of the defaults. And I think that is the best route. That is the route that is least surprising to a user of GraphQL who doesn't know the intricacies of like how the spec works and how the implementation works. And to me, I think that is by far the biggest issue. The fact that we actually break our promises in GraphQL is a massive issue, and we should fix that. But I think also the fact that it breaks that expectation is almost a bigger issue, because it just doesn't do what a user would expect it to do. And I think we should fix that.
So the good news is that this is fixable. It's just unfortunately really kind of ugly and complex to fix, right? There are plenty of other cases in the spec where recursion is possible, and we explicitly thwart it. But both in the spec language and definitely in the reference implementation, they're some of the most complex parts of those things, which is definitely unfortunate, but perhaps unavoidable. There's a question of whether the right thing is to simply, like you have this comment here that you have on screen, that's schema 1. Should that just be, should this fail? Because like if what your original proposal here is that this is actually a runtime property, however, there's an optimization where that can be memoized. That means that someone could produce this schema, deploy it to production, and assuming that maybe there's some integration test that triggers that memoized case, but because technically it's not until runtime that this broken schema could make it through and result in a broken surface. And I'm wondering if there's a way to sort of statically know that this is a problem.
Yeah, so I think that this is an invalid schema. It is currently valid, like it validates in GraphQL currently, but I don't think it should be a valid schema. And I think people looking at it would see that this looks like it should never end. So what I've put into the spec pull request is effectively that part of the validation of the arguments for fields or the input fields of input object types is that we already have a requirement that the default value there is coercible. So effectively, we just extend that to say it's coercible and it does not cause an infinite loop. But effectively, it would be schema build time that you would get that issue. It wouldn't be at runtime because we do that check up front. So it wouldn't happen. Yeah, it would happen when you're writing the software, not when you're running it in production.
So far, it's been mostly Benji and me speaking on this one. Anybody else have opinions on this?
Yeah, so I'm heartily in favor of moving any of the quirkiness or like, right, preventing the infinite recursion, anything like that to schema build time. Anything we can push to happen not at execution time is a win. But
hard agree.
From a technical implementation point of view, that seems, there's already some comments within this thread about, I think it actually came from Evan, about whether this happens at execution time or build time is really an implementation detail because it is so easy to memorize. But there is kind of an open question of whether we should kind of write it as a build time problem in the spec, or if that's kind of pushing things too far.
Has anybody actually tried to implement the solution to any of this in GraphQL JS yet? Because like, I think the fact that we don't know how to specify this beyond just don't cause an infinite loop suggests to me that the actual implementation of this is going to be really difficult. And maybe we should do the implementation first and figure out what's like feasible to implement before we try and write something in the spec that turns out is impossible to write. Like, you know, don't want to accidentally put the halting problem into our spec.
Also, like, by such points, we recently, like last year, we added a place that forbid infinite recursion in input objects, and we have like prevention of infinite recursion for fragment spreads. So, like technically, like checking for recursion is not something new. It's already there. Every time it's like increase code size. Every time it's like plus 600 lines or like 400 lines of code. And we didn't figure out how to generalize algorithms. So every time we just like copy paste like part of like checks, but it's not like unique in that sense. I also left like I want to mention I left like some notes previously, some objection to this proposal. I actually thought about that for longer time and I changed my opinion. Like it still increase our complexity budget, but at the same time, as Benji said, it's like expectable behavior. So thinking not about like implementers, but thinking about like clients who use GraphQL, it's like meet the expectation, and it's like it's a simplified mental model of GraphQL for them. So I'm like in favor of this change. One thing, yeah, like recursion is not like even not infinite recursion, but the way that previously default value was propagated to one level. So for a field, we use default value and stop there. But right now we need to go deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. Even if it's not recursive, we still need to go on every level. And like, so like, it's making me like nervous, but at the same time, I agree with like purpose of this change. And by the way, about check during schema build time, I think like Benji actually put it in section 3 type system. So checks from section 3 is done on schema build time. So yeah, you put it like type system. So it's like all the checks are done in schema build, like before execution, schema validation. We have like special function to validate schema, not SDL, not query, but just schema. So technically, we already prescribe that it's done during schema validation. I think like with, yeah, so with the things that Benji highlighted.
Can I just throw out maybe a somewhat controversial idea? I think that there might actually be two problems that we are solving here simultaneously, one of which is really, really important. And one of which, I don't know, maybe we want to be a little bit more stringent on whether it's a problem we're solving. So one problem that absolutely is important and should be solved is this very first motivating example that you provided, the comment that you used to open this whole issue, Benji, which just used a simple nullable number, an integer. In the scenario where you have a scalar, that scalar could be presented a null value because the default was not used in a predictable way. That's clearly problematic. But there's this other issue, which is using default values as this like empty input object. Is that reasonable? I think like having default values for input fields is reasonable because that means you can provide partial information at runtime. But is it reasonable to have a default value of an empty object at a query call site? Because if it's not, then we can really resolve this in a much cleaner way, even though it might restrict some possibilities.
So let me tell you the story of how I came across this issue. And unfortunately, it does mean, yes, I do think it is a sensible thing to do. So in PostGraphQL, there is when you request a collection of resources, you can add a condition should you want to. By default, we don't go as deep as, for example, Hasura do with deep complex queries, but we do allow you to do simple things like equality. So if you want to say, show me all the posts that aren't archived, you could say all posts condition archived false. Now, what you might want to do is to make it so that there is a default condition, which is don't show me posts that are archived. And then you can flip it so you can actually explicitly set it true or false if you want to. For that to work, because it's under the condition argument, the condition needs to have its own default. Now you could populate that that value, but if you were to go the kind of route that Hasura have in their complex filtering, you're going to have to populate quite deeply through that tree. But more importantly, there are situations where conditions, I don't know how to express this, they sort of like build up the complexity of doing that, of actually setting so that all of your default empty objects actually have all of the relevant things in them, is an expensive thing for you to do as a developer if you're doing it manually. But also it's something that you would expect to be done for you because you've already set the default properties on the fields. So you would expect them to already have been set, in my opinion. So the main issue that I had is I set the default condition, I set the condition for don't show me archived things. And then I set the default for the condition to be an empty object so that that actually was invoked, because otherwise it was null and it was ignored, and it didn't work. And I thought that was a bug in my code, but it turned out to be an issue in the GraphQL spec itself. It was unexpected for me, and I've been doing GraphQL for quite a long time. Not as long as you folks, obviously, but still quite a long time.
And I mean, that conclusion I definitely agree with, the fact that it is confusing. I know that I said that this is controversial. I just want to illustrate that there's a potential second way out here. And I appreciate that it moves the complexity rather than totally solves it, but I'm curious if it results in a net less confusion, where, you know, the alternative path here is every default value written into a schema, whether that's in, you know, a query. And I guess part of what makes this tricky is, no, I think what I'm saying makes sense here. If it's part of a query text, then that query text should be expanded, because that is something that is provided by a client. If it is part of a schema, that is something provided by the server. I think it is not totally unreasonable to say a server should always give you fully formed information, right? So if you and this kind of adheres to a principle that you see with interfaces as well, right? Like if you look at a type, you see all the fields you could query on that type. You don't need to go like crawl through subtypes and interfaces and like add them all up yourself to figure out all of the list of fields that you could potentially ask for. And so there's this kind of principle behind that, which is when you have to do very minimal navigation around documentation to learn about what it is that you're looking at. And I wonder if the same principle applies here for default values, where if you have a complex default value, if you have an input object default value, that, and seeing something that like this very, very first bit here, type query example input object, example input object equals empty object. The casual observer reading this before they click through example input object to see what the heck that thing is, looks at that and says, ah, the default value for this is nothing. It's an empty object with no fields. I think there's certainly, it would be surprising if you get to put null or something like totally busted there. That's clearly broken. We should fix that. But I think it's also somewhat surprising to find out that in fact that empty object had more properties in it that only happened because example input object put them there. That is certainly a convenience on the behalf of the schema author, that they don't have to then take those properties and the default values of an example input object and repeat them out in the places where they might be used. But this is why I'm asking about this, is like, is this a real problem? A real problem that people are having that we need to solve? Because in my experience, most of these input objects are used in one, maybe a few cases where there's like a mutation field that has that input object, or there's a query field that has that breakdown and there's like 3 variants of it maybe. Is it reasonable in that case to say like, you know, the value that goes here is going to be fully formed. It's going to include, it's going to be fully, like if we stick with the principle that we have now, which is if you don't provide anything, we'll take the value that's right here and use it, then that one could have all of the values in it that you expect to be used.
So I have a thought inspired by the parallel with interfaces, which you just brought up, which is that, yeah, in the schema, in the SDL, obviously, objects have to have the fields of the interface that they implement. But in like the code that defines the schema in languages that do it that way, you don't. So like in Ruby, you can implement node, and then you don't also have to manually redefine field ID. That just happens automatically when the schema is generated. Could we do the same thing here? Require that the SDL have all of the duplication and like fully specified defaults, but then if the language wants to like fill that in automatically for you, the implementation is welcome to do that.
I think there's one subtle thing that this previous discussion doesn't cover, and that's where these things are in use, showing that an object has different defaults may be something that a user wants to know. So if you look again at the example with the number, you might already know that example input object has, that number has a default of 3. So when you see the empty object, you know, oh, it's just going to use the default behavior for all the properties. If we had another property and we wanted to make it so one particular field uses the same input object, but has a subtly different default, like where it specifies an additional field in there and makes it more obvious. So like maybe it defaults to type cat rather than type dog, or not having a default for that. it's much less obvious for the user if you specify that object like in what you see through the GraphQL introspection to be that deeply nested object with all these extra properties. It's very hard to spot that this one thing is different from the norm. I think there's a lot of redundancy in indicating that if you've already specified in the schema that number is always default 3 for this input object, then putting number 3 for wherever that input object is used, take the PostGraphQL example, if it's a condition, those conditions are used anywhere that those collections exist, right? So at the root of the schema, also like on any things that have relations to those tables, loads and loads and loads of different places, you're going to end up specifying that same default field over and over and over again in your schema. It's going to be big, it's going to be hard to read and reason about. I do understand the point of view of saying, well, if it's fully specified, you can just look at it and you don't need to look at the other defaults. But again, that could also be solved with client tooling without adding that extra. It basically comes down to me to saying, if you see empty object in the schema as the default, it should be the same as if you pass an empty object to the schema. That just seems to me to be a very straightforward, easy to understand definition. Though I suppose what Lee is saying here is, well, we would never have an empty object because it would always be specified. So the situation wouldn't arise.
Yeah. I think this, like, this perspective that what you see when you put the empty object versus what you get should always be the same. Like, this makes sense, but also the idea that, like, well, you might not want to specify every field. We already have that situation with, for instance, interfaces where we have concrete types that implement the interface and 9 out of 10 of the fields return the same type or are of the same type, but one of the fields is a, like, if interface foo has field bar, where bar is another interface, and the concrete type has concrete bar as its type, like, you still have that, okay, yeah, I just copied 10 interface fields and only changed 1, right? So we still have, like, that seems pretty parallel to, okay, you have to specify everything. Basically, yeah, I'm actually coming down very much in favor of, if you have an input that has, if you have an input object with a default value, you have to fully specify what it looks like all the way down at the point of the SDL definition, rather than, like, which just simplifies execution a lot.
Benji, the premise that you framed, and you said there's some intuitive sense to it, I completely agree with. I think that's probably part of why the last time we discussed this, that was the direction we were going down, because that premise does make a lot of sense. Whatever you put there as a default, it makes sense that would behave the same as if you had just provided that as a client. But what I'm kind of responding to here, and why I'm proposing not a perfect here, but a potential alternative, is there's 2 separate pieces of complexity that unfold from this. One is this new concept that has to be introduced in the spec language. It's the difference between a default value and a coerced default value. It's like, now we're talking about, like, whether introspection gives you the pre or post coerced version of this thing, and this is actually the first time that we're kind of reusing this coercion concept outside of the context of taking a value provided from the client, providing it to the server, or vice versa. It's now happening, like, to take a written spec or schema document and, like, turn it into a final form. that part is some incidental complexity, and then also now this this infinite recursion case, right? Like part of we've talked about infinite recursion in input objects before, and decided that as long as input objects couldn't self-refer, right? You couldn't create a cycle, then we had nothing to worry about, right? Because as long as they describe plain data, then types can be recursive and data will not be. And as soon as we introduce this nested default value resolution scheme where anything along that path can be complex input objects, then we get this infinite recursion problem. And so this is why, like, I'm not necessarily saying that this path being proposed is the dead end and this other path is the right thing. What I'm saying is this an important problem that solving it is worth the cost of these additional pieces of complexity? It's worth the implementation cost of solving the infinite recursion, and it's worth the incidental complexity of the difference between coerced default values and regular default values. Or is this a theoretical problem where solving it in a less satisfying way, but a simpler way, is like the right budget of cost to value? And I think the way that we might solve this or answer this question is by looking at more concrete examples, queries that people are actually writing. And so I think if there's like a motivating example from PostGraphQL or from Hasura or from some of these schemas that really heavily use input objects and default values within those input objects, then that might motivate, right? Like if we're struggling to find a case where nested input objects with lots of default values exist, then maybe this is too much. But if we find that there's actually a bunch of those cases, and the out-of-the-box Hasura and PostGraphQL and a handful of other schemas are about to get really, really gnarly by having to repeat all their default values, then like maybe what I'm proposing here is not palatable, and we really have to do this original proposal.
So I don't think the actual implementation of this is particularly challenging, right? It's the same kind of cyclic detection that we use for fragments, like Ivan said before. My main issue is how do we write it in spec language for this case, rather than how do I write it in code? I think I could write it in code in about an hour. It's just tracking where you've been and seeing if you're trying to go there again, basically. And I think in terms of complexity of the implementation, we already have the situation where we are doing this for the variables that we pass through query documents. So we already have the default that is specified by the user, which could be the empty object, for example, and then the value that is actually used by the server, which is the baked version of that default value. So we do already have that situation you outlined. But you're right that we don't have it purely in the schema side. I'm not sure. Well, one of the reasons I don't think that's particularly important is because the fix that I've applied is effectively during execution. Now, we can memorize it and we can do it at schema build time, but it's the same code during execute. Like I've just copied the execution code from what we do with variables. So it is literally like in terms of schema spec changes in execution, it is like an extra line. That's really it, is let coerced value be the coerced value of the default value. Done, use that. It seems to me pretty straightforward to do that. And then at validation stage, all we've done is added an additional thing that just says the default value must be compatible and whatever it is that we need to do here for not causing the infinite loop. But I don't think that that's going to be a hugely complex thing to do. I'm just really not sure how to go about writing it. It might be that I need to find the relevant part for fragments in the spec and then rewrite that wording to reference types and fields. But I think one of the important things that we're making a decision on here is, are we going to solve this as part of the GraphQL schema so that people don't have to think about it? Or are we going to punt this problem to every single schema implementation so that every single developer has to discover this anyone who's writing schema definition language, for example, has to actually write every single value out if they're using these defaults. And I think it's something that we can solve without a huge amount of fuss in the GraphQL schema and save a huge amount of human effort outside of the GraphQL specification itself by doing so.
This is Mike Cohen from Indeed. We actually encountered this problem. You asked for some examples. I do have a schema that we use in production where we bumped into this problem. We're a little bit surprised that so we actually specified some of the fields on the nested input types as required and specified some default values, and found at runtime that they weren't present. So what we did was sort of lift those up and specify the individual fields explicitly as part of the default value specification, which is, I think, Lee, what you were suggesting as an alternative. So we definitely hit it. And this was on one of our, I'm happy to share the example if it's interesting or useful.
It's definitely, yeah, it would definitely be interesting. And I want to be clear, I definitely, this is a super important problem to solve. The fact that you can end up with an unintuitive result, especially the motivating example here, which is that you can have a schema which declares something is non-null, and then you get null. That's like risk for NPEs that will knock out servers. Like, this has to be solved. The question is, what is the path to solve it? And Benji made a really good point, which is that these nested input object, default values, we could get into a recursion case with just a provided input as well, not just these default values. So certainly, I think the blast radius of figuring this out is bigger. And complexity cost is just one thing to keep in mind here. The other is, you mentioned this solving or saving time for people. I do think this gets back to this a related principle to the idea of, with looking at a type, you see all the fields spelled out, even though they implement some interface. Evan mentioned a lot of implementations build the schema up for you, and they have like one layer down in the stack, they provide that time saver for you. And I'm of two minds on this, to be honest. I don't totally know. I just want to make sure that we're talking through all of the potential options. I do want to make sure that we're solving for readers of schemas more so than we're solving for writers of schemas. So if you're writing the SDL and you have to type a lot, I'm sorry, presumably way more people are going to be reading that thing than it is you writing it. And so it's probably the right thing for you to be writing more if that means that it is going to be easier to read. Now, if it won't be easier to read and you have to write more and it is more painful to read, then it's the wrong trade-off. But that I think is probably the crux of figuring out what the right path is here. Are there motivating cases where the default value spelling out the full value of the thing that you're about to get would actually be helpful? Then that would indicate that that's the path that we should follow, where these default values that appear in the schema are always fully formed. Or are there a lot of motivating cases, or even just a handful of particularly egregious ones, where having to do that actually makes the schema particularly less readable? And I guess to be crisp about what I'm asking for here is a couple of specific examples of edge or corner cases within schema that are real schema, where we can see the real effect that this decision might have. I suspect PostGraphQL, I know, has a lot of complex cases. Hasura has some complex cases that use these patterns. And I'm hoping that we can find some answers by looking at those real queries.
I think it's worth noting that the issue you're currently discussing is kind of like a third problem. on top of the previous two. And it is solvable with the spec edits that I have currently by adding one additional small change, which is when you output in introspection what the value is, you just use the coerced version rather than the raw version. It's that, then it's solved. That's your, what should be output as part of the schema can be toggled between, should it be the coerced version or the raw version. So I think that that's actually not a concern that should affect which path we take for solving this, because we can do it either way in both solutions.
I actually disagree. So like property of SDL and introspection that you can make cycle. You can take the SDL, you can pass through introspection, and you can print this SDL, and you will result with the same SDL. So I think like it's super important property to keep. So we cannot expand value from SDL and use expanded value introspection. So when a client print introspection into SDL, he will receive different SDL. We even keep like, I even change like a schema to keep the order the same. So we always have the same out, like we can produce the same SDL from introspections that was initially used to define a schema. So like I'm okay with both solutions, but we need to keep this property.
Right. I think that is a path. We would just, to preserve the property that Ivan has pointed out, we would have to use a technique that Evan suggested, which is to push it below the layer that the spec has visibility on. And so the implementation would allow you to write that thing, and it would be exposed up in a way that adheres to the spec, rather than the spec doing that coercion itself, or implying that there's a coercion to be done between what the schema says is there versus what you see come out of it. But I also, just to be confusing and provide a reason why not to do the counter proposal I'm suggesting here, is there's going to be incidental complexity in that path as well, because we don't have an algorithm right now that declares some value is fully formed while ignoring default values, which is essentially what we would be looking for here, right? To say, like, if you've got some input object and there's a number field and it takes 3, that number field has to exist in this particular form. That would be a new thing for us to have to go build. So yet more incidental complexity. So just to kind of put that there, that I think there's probably incidental complexity in either path that we go to solve this. I think actually that helps narrow it down, that really this is more a question about legibility than it is complexity.
I kind of agree. Like one thing to note, and it wasn't obvious for me, is that default values for input objects is part of coercion of input object. So basically, like coercion for scalars and coercion, we use like coercion for input objects to put default values in place. So like basically we need to define for every type, we need to define now for every input type, we need to define like 2 functions, coerce and validate, because we need to validate the default values that we specify is valid against it. So I agree with Lee. So like even if we stick with fully specified value, it's still like complexity. Instead of 2 callbacks, every input type should have like instead of 1 coerce, you should have like 2 coerce and validate. And one thing I would strongly like, it's like strong position for me, it should be the same for scalars and input objects. It should be the same algorithm, because it's the same algorithm right now. So if we define fully specified value, So it should be fully specified no senses. So it should be fully specified as like scholars, and it should be fully specified as like input object. So maybe to move
Right now we do have that validate function. It's just, I think it's literally, we check, can the default value be coerced? So it definitely needs some, at least some note there explaining in more detail. But that does exist at least. You get a schema validation error if you provide an incorrect default value. Evan, can you elaborate on what you just commented there?
Sorry, that was me catching up on Matt's post in the chat from like 10 minutes ago. that this was referring to his chat post, not to the current conversation.
Oh, okay. Still interesting though.
He was just saying that like default input objects in general are pretty low value potentially. And so maybe we should just forbid them entirely and short circuit this entire conversation. Which is interesting, like, because yeah, Shopify basically doesn't use them, so it's not out of the question for us.
Yeah, it's an extreme thing, but also right. I think they are used, but very, very rarely within Facebook. So at least that may be a history issue though, because I believe we have most of how you copy and paste code to build new types happened before I think we allowed input objects to have defaults. So that may not be actual, but from within Facebook, yeah, they seem low value.
I just did a search. Shopify's internal schema is 124,000 lines. We use exactly one default input value object, and it's a trivial one.
And the other thing here is if we could get 95% of our value, and then we just say, oh, you can have default scalars. And part of the problem though is that the horse is kind of already out of the barn. It would be difficult for us to release a new version of the spec that disallows input defaults on input objects, given there are schemas that exist with them. But
yeah, we're not going to see that. But that's what I'm saying here is not to take them away. It's just to make them annoyingly complicated by saying that you have to repeat if there's any additional default values within those, you got to repeat them all the way down. But this is going back to what I'm asking for here is I just want some use cases. Mike, I think you mentioned before that there were some cases within a schema that you had some purview over, had some default input objects. So I just love to see some of these cases. I think if we look at a bunch of schema across both product surfaces, Hasura surfaces, and we find very, very little evidence that making default input objects annoyingly complicated by requiring that they recursively list out all of their nested defaults, it is just not a problem, then I'd pitch that we go that route. If we find that, even if we find there's only a few, right? There's just enough cost there that it's painful, then probably the original proposal here is the right one, that we should just restrict the restrict recursion. And that's also, it's not an impossible thing to do. There's plenty of other places where we prevent infinite recursion.
So our examples are generally around actually our job search operation. So I think, I haven't looked at every single one, but this is the one that comes to mind. I think it may be the only place where this is relevant for us. So it's basically a search operation, and as you can imagine, somewhat intricate. I think probably every other operation does not have this problem.
How are you feeling about this state, Veggie?
What to do next is not immediately clear. Like, I feel like there are examples and I feel like that is enough, like that it doesn't do what is expected.
Well,
yeah.
Again, just to make it crisp, I think there's two problems. One painfully needs a solution, which is it is not acceptable that we have your original motivating case, the very first comment here, where you've got a bunch of cases and one of them ends up with a null value in a case where the type system suggested that that value could not be null. This has to be solved. This is really important. So
100%.
The question before us is not whether or not we need to solve this problem. Even just the theoretical example there is enough to convince me that that has to be solved. The question before us is, do we solve this by recursive coercion of default values, or do we solve this by requiring that default values be fully formed such that recursion is not necessary? In the former, we need to protect against infinite recursion. In the latter, we need to define what it means to be a fully formed input object when default values exist below. So in either case, there's some incidental complexity. So I think the question boils down to what is easier to read and what are real world schema cases of this shape, so that we can make an informed choice. So the next step would be then to gather input from real schema that have examples of default input objects.
I'm happy to share our example. What's the best way for me to do that?
If you would like to comment on this pull request, I think that's probably the best way, just so that we can keep everything in one place.
Yeah.
Similarly, Evan and Matt, if you guys can share cases where you're seeing default input objects.
I think what you're asking for is examples where it would be prohibitively horrible to explicitly specify every component of the default input object, right? Like we've definitely got customers who use default real world schemas out there that use default input objects where they even specify multiple levels of object within a default, which is kind of ugly, but they're already doing it. So I'm not like, I think that's not a counterexample to your simplicity proposal. Am I understanding that right?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I'm also maybe overcorrecting here by responding to the discussion that Matt and Evan were having about whether, obviously we're not going to go all the way to removing things because that would break stuff, but to just kind of push the discussion that way for the sake of argument, even just looking at, are there cases where it sounds like in the schema that Matt and Evan have purview over, that they could just pull literally all the examples and just list them out. And that would just kind of be interesting to look at. And so, Mike, if you've got lots of examples, then maybe just picking the ones that are most relevant to the discussion will be helpful.
Sure.
Cool. Sorry, I know we went on this one for a while. I am motivated to get this solved because I think the root issue here is pretty concerning. But I do want to make sure we make a good decision. And if we end up doing the original proposal based on additional data, then I'll feel really, really good about that.
Cool. So I guess action on everyone to post what their input objects defaults are. I'm particularly interested if they have fields within the input objects that have defaults, and also if they have arguments that have defaults that are input objects.
Also, Benji, if you wouldn't mind pulling some examples of cases you found within PostgreSQL use, and then also I know you did a little digging in Hasura, and I know that they heavily use input objects. So
yeah, I don't know if they.
Cases.
Honestly, I've not used Hasura yet, so I don't know whether they actually use any defaults on their filters. But I know that they do have deeply nested filters, so you can imagine a situation where specifying a default filter might be beneficial. But yeah, maybe I'll reach out to Tanmai and see if he's got anything.
That's a great idea.
This is maybe a really small detail, but one of the things that the GitHub API does, I think somebody just linked to their API, is, if I recall correctly, they include just one input object for operations that represents all of the arguments. And so that may be something to consider. I think that's pretty prevalent in the community because it makes consumption by clients a bit simpler when you're, when there are a lot of inputs. So I think that's a common practice. It's something that we do here at Indeed. So that may exacerbate this slightly.
Oh, that's super fascinating. Yeah, I'd love to see more information on that.
All right, so for me, just tell me, I don't know, at some point, if it gets important to see something like, because I'm looking at schemas that are not mine, they're from our customers, so I can't share it. But if there's something that is going to make a difference in the conversation, I can try to follow up to either just share the pattern or try to get permission from someone or whatever. But like I just looked at one example and search, and it's, the search people are saying in the chat, and is the same thing I'd done. It's got over 200 cases of that. So, I mean, like you said, clearly people are using it, at least when, I guess, people who decide that it's a pattern that for whatever reason, maybe not for good reasons, just because they didn't know much GraphQL, but people who go into it might start using it again and again. But I don't think this one's a problem for either suggestion, because I think they specify all their values every time, even multiple levels of nested big, objects of objects specified. So I think it's not relevant for me to track anything down, but I have examples. So if something becomes relevant, just let me know.
I would also point out that if we look at existing schemas, we're going to find things are fully specified, because it literally doesn't work if we don't fully specify them.
Yes.
So we have to worry about a little bit of a bias in the sampling there. But yes, it's good to find out where it is being used and whether putting defaults in different locations would make sense. For example, the GitHub one, they use it for order by, for example, and they specify fully what the order by is by saying the field and the order. But you could imagine they don't actually have defaults on the field and order, but you can imagine where if they had a default for the order to be always ascending, where you might want to specify just the field, and that would be a combination of those things. But it happens that GitHub don't do that, and maybe they don't do it because it would be confusing.
That's a good point. Yeah, that's right. If people are listing out default values or they're omitting fields because of the bug that you found, Benji, they probably are broken and not performing the way that they're supposed to, or they are just listing everything out. And so I guess specifically what we're looking for are cases where either you find that someone is very likely facing this bug, in which case, especially more since you have clients who are building these schema, you should let them know. But then also, if there are cases where there's a really complicated looking one, especially in the scenario where the input object that is being used as a default value, the type of that input object itself has default values that are being repeated there. Those are probably the most interesting ones to look at, to speak to the kind of sampling bias Benji is pointing at, because those would be the counterexample, right? That would be like, here's a case where in order to make it work, they had to list out everything. and it's really ugly and probably hard to maintain. And this is what we want to solve for in the first place. So I think those are going to be the most interesting ones.
Is there a good collection of GraphQL APIs? I know, Ivan, you had one at one point, and the APIs guru. Is there, what I'd really like is just a repository that is full of just GraphQL schemas, just literally GraphQL schema files. That would make answering these kind of questions much more straightforward.
So we actually wanted to build that, and idea that we have like a list in as README, and we also have a accompanying JSON. And inside this JSON, we actually tried it, and I think it's possible with GitHub Action. So if anybody is willing to contribute that, I will gladly merge it. GitHub Actions that use list and dump schemas to GitHub pages branch. Yeah, I agree. It would be useful for research projects.
I wonder if Apollo have anything, because they obviously have their schema store. I wonder if they know which of those schemas are public and if they could produce something like that relatively easily.
That's a great question. You could probably ask James, probably just ping him in that thread.
Cool. Action me ping James. Is someone taking notes on this? I hope so.
Sorry, I took notes up until about 10 minutes ago, and then I started participating in the conversation and got distracted.
It's okay. It looks like our notes are very reasonably up to date. Thanks for helping with that.
I just shared a list of GraphQL APIs that are public that might be helpful in that regard.
Like we after it. It's what I meant by like we will accept. I will match like contribution if somebody implement GitHub Action the dump introspection. So inside this repo, it's not only like README with a list, but also JSON files. So it's like it's possible to get introspection in theory. In practice, you need also to have like client keys for some of the APIs.
I do want to mention something. So a few years ago, if you recall, there was another person that joined us often. His name was Eric Whitturn. I worked on a research paper with him called An Empirical Study of GraphQL Schemas, where we actually collected around 8,400 GraphQL schemas from GitHub projects. But I'm not sure, I don't think we open source this repository. I think there's like some, we cannot republish publicly accessible data from GitHub due to usage rights. But I don't know, maybe I can think of some way where I can let you guys use these schemas somehow.
That's amazing. Even just kind of running that kind of simple search that that Evan suggested, just like looking for equals space open brace.
Yeah, in
show you
in the study we
examples
collected much more than that, but we basically we ensured that all the schemas were unique, and also some schemas, they were divided into multiple different files within a repository, and we found ways to combine all that together. But I'm not sure how I can allow you guys to access this kind of data because of usage rights.
GraphQL Java, we recently added a schema anonymizer function, which lets you produce an anonymized version of a schema which retains all the structure. So maybe I could help with something to kind of keep the structure, but make them accessible, like in an anonymized way.
Would an anonymized schema still be useful in this discussion? Because we're trying to figure out like the context, right, and use cases.
Well, I think it would still be useful because you can still see all the input default values. You can see the structure and everything, but not the naming, or like the names would be blacked out. But
It
the
might
structure
be
is fully retained.
It might be valuable, as Andy says, because it means that you could potentially share the anonymized versions. We can find which ones of those are relevant, and then you can then decide whether or not those original versions can ultimately be shared by checking the license or whatever of just that one schema rather than 8,600.
Actually, now that I'm thinking of it, if I can do the anonymization and then I let you access that kind of data, and we do identify schemas that could be useful within this data set, I also have references to the specific repository and the commit that's associated with it. So in that case, I can probably at least link you guys to the schema, and I won't be directly sharing data with you. So
nice. That sounds awesome. That's an amazing data set to have. But even in the case where it was without that context, I think it would still be useful. Because really, I think what we're after here are we seeing this kind of shape of these like complex and nested default input objects in real schema. So even if the context was lost, just knowing that that shape existed and it was found in a real schema that someone was using, that's still a really, really useful data point to have. And just kind of knowing like the range of complexity of the shapes that we're seeing and the frequency is really going to help us out. But even having the commit, even better. All right. I know we spent a lot more than 15 minutes on that, but worthwhile. I'm going to do things a little bit out of order just because, Benji, I've had you do a lot of talking and give you a little bit of a break. And we'll move on to talk about deferred stream updates from Rob before we move back in the agenda. So Rob, will hand it to you if you're still there.
Yeah, not a huge update again, but so I think we're mostly blocked on JavaScript side by the TypeScript migration, but we do have the official experimental branches of GraphQL.js and Express GraphQL. Liliana and I talked at a couple of meetups, and we wrote a blog post, which the GraphQL account tweeted. So I think anyone who would be interested hopefully knows about these branches and can try them out. We got a bunch of feedback about a few things on an issue that I had posted. And I just had like two small things that have come up that I want to discuss. The first one is in the stream directive. We have the initial count argument, which we had originally said that it will be a required argument. Benji recommended just making it optional and defaulting to 0. I don't really have like a super strong opinion about it. I'm just doing it out of being a conservative, where making things required instead of assuming like assumptions of it not being there. But I guess I just kind of want to get opinion on what direction everyone thinks we should go with for that.
Can you remind us of the purpose of the initial count argument?
Right. So on this, you put the stream directive on a list field, and whatever you set initial count to, you'll get that many results in the initial payload, and then each result after that will get streamed. So if you set 0 in your first response, you're going to get an empty array, and then each result will come back. If you say 3, you'll get the first 3 in the initial payload. And I think like the main use case is you have you're showing a list item on your screen, and above the fold of the page, you could only fit so many. So you would have how many ever you could fit in that initial count. And so you get those immediately while everything below the fold comes in asynchronously.
I definitely have less context on this than others have, but I feel like Benji's suggestion here makes a lot of sense to me. That a lot of people are going to try to write this directive without any arguments, and the behavior of the initial count being 0, as you described it, is exactly what I would have expected to have happened.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable. We originally were talking with Kuwait and Jafar a while back about getting really exotic with how things could get batched together, where it's the servers defining it, and instead of getting one result at a time, you could get groups of them. But I think we decided not to do that because it gets really complicated very quickly. And so was just trying to be conservative with arguments, but yeah, I think we could just, it's pretty nice to just use stream without any arguments at all. So I could make that change.
Is the initial argument, is it maximum number or minimum number? So if I specify initial count 0, can server send me something?
With the spec, we're saying that you should get the number that you specify.
So even if during resolution, like server have like some items, it should still wait and send it afterwards.
Yeah, that's what we were saying. I mean, that was part of what we were thinking about, where maybe like one option is that if you don't put it, the server could do whatever it thinks is best. But for now, like we wanted it to be required just so it was clear that whatever you're saying is what the server has to do.
That's kind of confusing to me, or at least unintuitive. I would expect that the server has much more information about what information is ready to go. And requiring it to withhold data that is ready seems counterintuitive. Like if I ask it to stream and it's got something, I don't know, maybe just the act of preparing the parent body brings 1 or 2 items from that list in cache, and that's just like ready, then why not send them out of the gate? Presumably, almost always, especially in this case of initial count being 0, you would expect that empty object. But like if you said initial count 3, and the first streamed batch from the back end has 5 in it, like why would the server not just send you 5?
It could be that like the resolvers underneath the list items still take a long time to load, or it could be like a massive amount of data where even if it is ready, it's the cost of transporting it is large. In theory, the server could know that though.
Actually,
yeah.
Thinking about that, I agree with Rob. So we even have another argument. It's like we will have predictable stream and predictable shape of responses. So like if it can be more, like you can get like everything in one response, or you can get in couple responses if it's like 5 elements in collection at all. Like server can send one response and doesn't send consequences one, or like, so I agree with Rob. One thing, if we allowing it to be optional, maybe change its name from initial count to something that like by default we expect everything to be sent in subsequent batches. Maybe we can rename it to inline items or something like reverse its meaning. So if you want to something to be included in the first batch, you specify this parameter.
Is that a different meaning than what it is now? Where initial count 2 means you get 2 in the first batch in the inline previous response with everything after 2 being asynchronous.
I think that the usage of a term like inline is probably clearer, independent of what Ivan just said, is probably clearer than initial count, because it's not clear when you're streaming whether the initial count is what you're going to get on the first follow-up payload or whether you're going to get it actually as part of the initial GraphQL request, right? Because the stream, it might be like, when you start streaming in a moment, once you've resolved everything else, then give me the initial 5. Whereas really what it's doing is actually inlining it into the query, which is different from the rest of the stream. So there is distinction there.
Maybe the note to take away here is that you could just do some bike shedding on the name, and if you kind of decide the name still makes sense, then that's totally fine. But probably a good thing to especially discuss with QA and crew. I suspect that there's enough kind of behavioral complexity with how streaming works, just kind of by necessity, that kind of no matter what we name these things, we'll need some explainers around how to use streaming data. So I wouldn't hold out for being able to completely self-describe this with the names alone, but it is worth making sure that the terms we're using here are the best ones that we can think of. It is also, I do want to just kind of challenge the requiring that initial set to be a particular size. Maybe that's the right thing. I know your team and QA's team have talked about this a lot, and so maybe it's the right thing. I just want to push on it a bit because it seems unintuitive to me. The case that you made makes sense, right? Like, hey, if you say I want an initial 2 because I know I'm building some objects that are expensive, and the server has 100, that like building 2 is a lot cheaper than building 100, and that's what I want. But if the server decides like, hey, you asked for 100, but you also said you wanted to stream the first 2, and I've got 3 ready for you, and I know that they're all in cache, and I can do that very quickly. There's a principle to be defined, I think, which is like how should the client and the server talk to each other when the client says I want X? Is that a rule or a requirement or a constraint? You know, like saying that this is a minimum constraint, that intuitively makes the most sense to me. That says like I don't want to display something to the user that has fewer than this many items because my UI will look broken, as opposed to a performance problem, which is hey, I don't want you, the server, to spend this much time loading data, and I want to like figure that out in a backwards way by saying, you know, hey, I know I the client know better than you, the server, about how long you, the server, takes to produce information. So I'm telling you to go build 2 items or 3 items or 4 items, whatever. That's the part that seems unintuitive to me. I would expect the server would have a lot of information about what is or isn't fast. And if the client says, hey, I need the first result back in this amount of time, then like provide a minimum milliseconds instead of a minimum count or something like that. So those are more loose thoughts than something specific, but I do think it'll be worthwhile if this yields out some principle about how the server and client describe constraints to one another.
Yeah, to expand on what Lee just said, de facto, it is a minimum anyway, because if the server doesn't support stream, you will get all of the results inlined.
Well, we had said that if the server doesn't support stream, it should pretty much flat out reject the directive. And I think like we talked about a similar idea with defer, where we were saying, should the server be allowed to say, I know that this deferred fragment can be loaded quickly, so I'm not going to defer it at all. And where we came up with that was that we would say in the spec that we would allow the server to do that, but we would make it really clear that really you should really have like a pretty advanced use case where you are able to know these things. And because we really wanted to discourage people writing servers that say they do support defer, but then actually just ignore it. And the reason for that being that when you're writing something, it might be better to split something up into separate queries instead of using defer. So you wouldn't want to like think you want defer to be like reliable that it's going to happen. I don't think I'm explaining that very well, but so if I'm writing some UI code and I have a choice where I could use defer, I cannot use defer, or I could split it up into separate queries. The order of best performance might be defer first, separate query second, and no defer at all third. So you wouldn't want to write with defer, but then end up getting the lowest performing one when you could have done the alternative. So yeah, so anyway, the point is, we said that we would highly encourage that if a server supports defer, it should honor it, unless you're really, really sure that you know that not deferring something is better. So we would allow that case. So I think it makes sense. You could do the same with stream, where the client should be able to reliably depend that the data is going to get streamed. But if the server really knows that sending more than the initial count is, we could leave it open in the spec. So the server could do that.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
just
think you're muted.
I'm sure Rob and Kawhi have discussed this, but like internally, we actually like, so Facebook has had a huge amount of usage of stream defer internally. We internally require initial count says this is what you will get, but we also have an escape hatch of like, if you want to allow the server to define what to do, here's a Boolean, like, I, the product, am now abdicating the responsibility down to the server. And right, it's not clear to me that that's the actual correct like spec version of defer, but that probably the action item on like is get Kawhi to chime in to explain exactly why this choice is, so that we can have a concrete like, this is what makes sense for the spec or not. I will say like, it does make sense. There are very explicit use cases where if you're trying to get something on screen as quickly as possible, the cost of the server, cost of the server getting the 100 items in the list might be less than the cost for the client to be downloading those 100 items over the network. So there are definitely situations where even if the server has all items for your list available and ready to go, you still want to only receive 2 on the client first so that you can start rendering while continuing with this asynchronous network request.
That makes sense. And Rob, I think what you were suggesting is kind of what was proposing, which is the server shouldn't just like ignore the requirement here just because it happens to have something, but only in the case that it knows better, right? And that's kind of the principle that I'm asking that we kind of deduce out of this is how can we make sure that the knowledge or the requirements of the client and the knowledge of the server combine best to produce the best outcome, right? Because you can also imagine a case where if you say, I know we're talking about stream and not defer here, but if we say defer, if you put a defer on a boundary, it will always come back split, always, as a rule. And you can kind of get in the situation where you actually have a local cache. So all the data is available, but because of the requirement, like UI has now made some, the UI will break if you happen to, draw it in one pass instead of two passes. And now what you've done is you just put like a weird redraw blip in your UI that's like unavoidable. Where what you would expect to happen is if all that data is available in a local cache where you don't even need to go to the server to go get it, then like you probably shouldn't defer it. It should just like all render immediately. But that is against the thing that you said is like defer has to come back in two chunks. So as long as there's sort of like room for knowledge below the query boundary to make decisions that go against what I don't want to end up in a situation where you're like, well, the spec says X, but the spec is too strict. If we had to break the spec in order to get reasonable behavior, like that's exactly what we're trying to avoid, right? Like we want the spec to describe the constraints and describe non-normatively the best behavior and the ideal outcomes based on these principles, and then allow clients and servers to get to something reasonable. Hopefully the spec text is there, where if it says we require it happen this way, then that requirement can be counted on, that servers and clients will adhere to it. That way tools and super cool front-end technology can leverage it to do stuff.
Yeah, that makes sense.
We went on too long on that topic. There's another one you wanted to talk about as well, right? Or did we hit both?
Yeah, well, just to summarize, just how we already had like an escape hatch for defer that the server doesn't have to do it. We could have the same for the number of items that get sent over in stream. But just needs to be clear that that doesn't mean that a server should just say that it supports stream and defer and just ignore them all the time, because then that's a bad developer experience.
Really. I think the may, should, must sort of spec-y language of this is that these should be shoulds, not musts, because the server might break them or a local cache might break them, and so therefore they can't really be musts. It should be shoulds.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, and then the second point was that in the directive location in the schema, there's a bunch of options, and for stream it's field, but it's not really statically saying that it's a list field. So I haven't dug like very much into it, but I just get the sense that that could be like a breaking change if we were to add a new one that represents an existing concept. Or so I just want to know if that's something worth looking into more, or is a runtime validation rule that you can't use stream on a field that's not list good enough?
I think I understand the issue being proposed here. The solution being proposed, I don't know that I necessarily agree with. So the purpose behind the directive locations was so that arbitrarily defined directives produced by anyone could have that base level of validation that all tools would agree upon, even though that tool had no knowledge about that directive, right? So if you came up with Rob Richards' super cool deferred directive, and that was the name of it, that you could say like, hey, this can only apply to fields. And GraphQL would immediately know what the @Rob Richards magical deferred field validation rule is for that. But we're talking about putting this in the spec, which means we can put whatever other additional validation logic we want on top of it. We don't have to necessarily rely on only the ones that were available for arbitrarily defined directives, which if this was going to be an arbitrarily defined directive, maybe this would be the right thing. the other piece is that the directive locations describe parts of the spec AST. And so this would imply that a field and a list field are two different kinds of structure of the schema. And I think that will probably just, they're not really. This would kind of smush together the AST and the type system in a way that I think would actually be kind of really complicated and difficult to implement and enforce. So my proposal would be leave it alone to say that you can only put it on a field in terms of directive locations. But you probably don't want to wait only until runtime to say, hey, you put this directive on a place where it's not allowed to go. If this is going to be a directive that's defined in the spec, then it's worthwhile to also include validation logic to make sure that it's used correctly. And that validation logic seems reasonable that we should say a stream directive can only be provided on a field that returns a list type.
Yeah, by runtime, I meant like just in the GraphQL validation section of the spec.
Yeah, but during
not during execution.
Query validation, but yes.
Yeah.
That's my opinion. I saw some thumbs ups appear on the screen, but anybody else have anything to add?
Okay, that was it. I'll make those updates for initial count, and I'll make sure that we have the validation rule in GraphQL.js and in the spec. And I guess just anyone else that Benji's been reviewing the spec, which is great, and just any other eyes we can get on it would be helpful.
Thanks again for your persistent work on this. I feel like every month there's updates and every month there's actions. And so this was the one that when you all first proposed that, I think it was at the beginning of the year that we started talking about it.
Yeah, 1 year ago.
Like it was gonna go on forever. And actually, this is one of the most complex additions to the spec, and it's happening really fast in comparison to almost everything else. Even though it feels like it's taking a long time, if you look at some of the like comparables here, they took much longer. So I think that's a credit to the consistent work you've been putting into it. So thank you.
That's good to hear.
Welcome, Mark. We didn't forget you. We held your agenda item in hopes that you would show up to talk it through.
Yeah, sorry about that, everyone. I had a rough couple of days there, but well, thanks for waiting. So I guess I'll get into it then.
Before we start with Mark, would it be okay for Andy to have his topic, because I know he needs to pop away?
Yes. Thanks for reminding me. Let's talk about alternative meeting times before you have to disappear, Andy. I'll hand it to you.
Yeah, thanks, Benji. Yeah, I just wanted to quickly ask if it would be possible to maybe alternate the meeting time sometimes, or adjust them on a scheduled rhythm, so that it's a little bit more friendlier for the Australia and New Zealand area. Currently, we have our meetings at 4 a.m. Australian time, which is a little bit brutal, and it's yeah, like just moving 2 hours ahead, for example. This is a little bit my specific ask, would be making it start at 6 a.m. Would the downside of moving 2 hours ahead is, especially for the Indian area and Asian area, it would get quite late, so there's no perfect time to cover the whole world, obviously, but maybe we can alternate it sometimes, and yeah, I wanted to open up for discussion and asking for opinions.
Be happy to alternate between, like, North American time zones and Asian time zones or something. I think that's totally fair.
For Pacific Coast US, this is first thing in the morning. So the idea of pushing it back by 2 hours is very palatable. I know that pushes things back. I think, especially for folks in Europe, that gets a little bit trickier. I know this is already a little bit after working hours.
Yeah, so for Europe it would be
about moving.
So for Europe it would be pushed in a little bit after working hours, but I would argue still into the I'm awake hours. Like it depends a little bit what the goal is, to keep it in working hours or just reasonable. But I agree, for Europe it would be pushed a little bit on the edge of the day. It would start at 9 p.m. for like I see on the meeting planner for Helsinki, Finland, it would be 9 p.m. for example. For Central Europe, like Germany and stuff, would be 8 p.m. the starting time. Ivan, I think you're our most persistent Europe resident at the moment, or one of them. What is your opinion?
Did you ask me, right?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. So moving it 2 hours later, right?
2 hours later, yes. That would be my suggestion, at least sometimes.
It will start 9 p.m. for me, and if it's usual, we keep in like 2 hours. So yeah, it's like normal. So yeah, it's like finishing 11 p.m. It's not like super cool, but it's still like, as you said, it's possible. Versus like wake up at 5 in the morning or 4 in the morning. Yeah, it's less than, I would say. So I'm okay.
I'm okay with this. I'm in London, well, London time zone. I'm actually in the South Coast. But I do wonder whether we need to consider the knock-on consequences for the technical steering committee that we're meant to meet at the beginning of each session. Yeah, no, I just wanted to make that point. I'm happy, whatever.
We could also potentially split the meeting. So for instance, if there are specific agenda items, this is not necessarily a great thing, but like we could do the meeting in 2 hour-and-a-half or a 2 hour and 1 hour block or something like that, split, so that, and now it goes, if people that want to be part of a specific agenda item, it would require a lot of coordination up front, though. It would require us to not be submitting PRs 10 minutes before the working group meeting. So yeah, that is also another potential way to deal with this.
I'm for predictability. So like for me, it's like easier to have it at night versus have it like at random times. So what I suggest, maybe we can have easier solution. Like I like this voting system that Benji use for choosing like input union working group hours. Can we do like include everybody in this call, and to reach everybody from technical steering committee and ask them to specify not preferred hours but possible hours, and if everybody is so okay with like moving it 2 hours back, we can do it. Because right now, if it's okay for everybody, so we don't need to make complex mechanism. I would say like people on this call and like technical steering committee.
I'm okay with this, and I kind of agree with you that predictability is ideal, just because it is one less thing to be confusing. But I'm also okay with the time shifting. If we want to pick sort of like 2 times that work and alternate between them, I think that's potentially doable, especially if we can get them all on a shared calendar. Brian's helped us manage that, so I think that can be reasonable to do. Then at least you can get them blocked on your calendar in advance. It can be okay. I want to make sure that we don't have kind of a selection bias with the sets of people who kind of settled into being regulars on this call. Andy, I know you care a lot about the work that you do and that we're doing here, and that's part of the reason why you braved the early wake up to join us. But I suspect perhaps if the time wasn't so inconvenient, then perhaps more people in your time zone or near areas might be willing to join. And similarly, so it's relatively late in the day in Europe, and we've had actually pretty reasonable attendance from folks who are in Europe, but I imagine if we permanently pushed it out by 2 hours, that might suffer. And so I don't want to end up in a position where we kind of just rebalance the attendance based on who's able to come. That'll, I think, kind of move the problem rather than solve it.
Yeah, like my suggestion of moving it for 2 hours was basically, this was the smallest change that has an impact on the Australian area in positive way. But it's like, you're right, and I actually agree that we should consider the bigger picture and make it suitable for the biggest amount of people most of the time. That should be like the underlying goal. And this would probably call for maybe even 3 different meeting times we alternate to cover the whole world in a reasonable time, if you want to go down this road. Which would be also totally fine for me. It was based on my personal experience, but also, like you said, it's a bigger issue. We want to make it as open as possible for everybody around the world, I think. And we don't have anybody from Asia right now, probably because it's in the middle of night now. It's, I don't know, it's like 1 a.m. or so, and it could be definitely a reason. And I know, for example, at least one person I think who wanted to attend more often from this area, and he could not make it, I think, or it's very hard to make because it's in the middle of the night. But this would be meaning
something similar in chat here, that we don't have many folks from the Asia region. And
yes.
Andy, I think what you said is probably exactly the reason why.
Maybe just opening a GitHub issue and discussing possible options would be the best way to go.
I agree. That's the right action.
Okay, I will open a GitHub issue and propose maybe some ideas, and maybe we can talk about it on the issue a little bit more.
I wish GitHub had a way to do polling. Maybe we can do a doodle for this. I'll take an action to do a little bit of research to see if there's a great way to collect input. Worst case, I'll make a Google form just because I know how that works. And we can collect some information and use that to inform a choice. Okay, it sounds like at a bare minimum, at least having moving this meeting time forward by 2 hours sounds palatable to the Europeans on the call, and seems also reasonable to people in East and West Coast US, North American time zones. So at least we got some choices there. Yeah, I'm seeing some calls for doodle polls, so I'll take a look at that too.
Yeah, that was basically from my side. I wanted to start the discussion a bit and to increase the awareness around that this is not the perfect time for the whole world. Thank you.
Noted. Yeah, thanks for raising this. Okay, Mark, to you for Schema Coordinates update.
Cool, thanks. Hello, everyone. So yeah, have spoken about this a lot in the past few working group meetings, but just as a super quick 30-second reminder for those who have not attended any of the previous meetings, Schema Coordinates is this spec that takes the existing convention of referring to the name field on a user type as user.name. So it kind of shores that up as a formal spec and adds some more things onto it as well, such as field arguments. So over the past few months, the RFC and the spec edit has been out on GitHub, and thanks everyone so far who's reviewed those. I think we made a lot of great progress. The last kind of where we left off last time was that field arguments was the kind of last thing that people had some discussion over, and kind of what the syntax of that is going to look like. And there were kind of like two main contenders. There was, you know, if you have like, you know, you want to search for businesses, so you would have, you know, query dot, you know, business, and maybe business has like a ID field or something. So you would have like query dot business dot ID to refer to the ID argument, or you might have business dot query dot business and then brackets ID. Maybe someone can type that in the chat. ID colon close bracket. So it was kind of like what that syntax should look like, and I think we wanted a bit more consensus before moving forward and merging stuff. So we've had a lot of discussion on the GitHub threads, and now I guess I'm kind of here to yeah, take any discussion that people wanted to have in person and see kind of like where that consensus lies, and see kind of when, how, where we make next steps. And I guess I look to Lee for his sage counsel on how we do that.
Well, first I'll just do some sort of mechanical things here. This is a little bit overdue, but since you split those docs into two different parts, I got the appropriate labels on the actual RFC, which is just the RFC document. And that looks like most of the discussion thread there is settling out. So I'm just going to merge that one, and it's got the appropriate RFC document tag. That doesn't mean that you can't change that. The whole point of kind of adding that in is that any additional discussion on that RFC document, if necessary, can be added as additional pull requests. And then I just moved the proposal RFC1 label over. So if we wanted to talk about advancing that, we can. But I just wanted to make sure that we had that in the right spot. I'll land this other folks first. I know, Benji, you've been doing a lot of review. What's your thoughts at this point?
Lee, your microphone's cutting out a little bit for me from time to time. Yeah, I'm happy with it. In conclusion.
Let me know if you can hear me better. I changed my microphone.
Much better.
Great. So I'll be honest that I haven't had a chance to catch up on the changes that have been made in the last couple of weeks. I think I did a review after a meeting last time. And Mark, I know you've put a bunch of work into it between then and now. But I guess what we should talk about here is whether this should be lifted from RFC1 to RFC2. It seems like the spec changes have advanced quite a lot. They're in a really solid state. Benji is also pretty happy with it. So those are probably in draft form. They can probably use some review, but it looks like at least Benji's really happy with them. And Mark, you mentioned that there's JavaScript changes in place. Is that right?
I think that was one of the open questions, and we said that we will not make any JavaScript changes. I think there's space for some like library land utility helpers. For example, if you have some documents that you want to turn into a set of schema coordinates for things like analysis. But I think we said that there's probably enough edge cases there, and like behavior that needs to be decided, that we'll just leave that for library land and we won't make any changes. So I'm happy with that. I think we were in like a pretty similar state kind of like last month. But we just said that since there was this open question over the syntax of field arguments, we wanted just some time for it to marinate and let people have discussion. And I myself was like 50-50 last month, but having thought about it, and I just kind of, I agreed with I think what Benji was saying, and I think we did have a lot of discussion there. So I'm like myself a bit more confident now about the option proposed. But yeah, I wanted to just I think we wanted to leave it out there just for a little bit more time, see if any more discussion happens. I haven't seen any more discussion than what we last had, but I guess that's part of like why I'm here today, to see if there was anything anyone had in person. But beyond that, I don't think there's anything else hugely controversial that should block us from moving forward.
In terms of JavaScript or reference implementation changes, I would suggest at least that we add the parsing logic. Like there should at least be like a parser and a printer function, right? So that like given one of these schema coordinates, you should be able to parse it into an AST, and given one of these ASTs, you should be able to print it back out into a coordinate. I think that's probably a minimum, because that would give people the tools that they need to actually use this. And then the two additional ones that I certainly wouldn't require in order to move this RC to 2, but seems like they might be the most useful utilities, is given a piece of a schema, like if you have some reference to some part of a schema, can you create a schema coordinate from it via some function? Like there's some function that you put a piece of schema reference in and you get a schema coordinate out. And that one might be tricky because you don't always have kind of the back references to know how you found that. But the other one that I think is probably very useful is, given a schema and given a schema coordinate, return out, like basically follow the algorithm as written in the spec, right? Given a schema and a schema coordinate, return out the thing that schema coordinate refers to. That I think, I wouldn't require that to go to RC2 by any means, but that seems like probably the most useful thing to.
Yeah, that makes sense. So just to clarify, we have these two printing functions in GraphQL.js, but you don't think that this blocks the RFC advancing?
For the RFC advancing, I would like at least the parser and printer, and that one should be probably very easy to go build. I hope, because the syntax here is relatively straightforward, and that just because that will allow you to write the unit tests for it, like it's just the kind of the other side of the coin of making sure that we've got all of our I's dotted and T's crossed with anything that is language related. And so I would say, like, as long as we've got those up ready for PR, like that's the bar for stage 2, that we've kind of written down, that the changes are sort of ready for review, means that they're RFC2 ready. And then once they're sort of like merged and released, then it's accepted. And so I'll just kind of leave it to you to decide if you want to kind of go further than that and add this additional piece which implements this logic that, given a schema and a schema coordinate, return out the part of the schema that you're talking about. Sounds fun to write. I think that one is probably going to be pretty useful to have, but if you don't get to that one, I think that's okay.
Yeah, no, totally happy to kind of look into that, and yeah, I'm sure we'll have discussion on the eventual PR to talk about future functions we could add there as well. That all sounds great to me. I'm happy to kind of go away and do that homework. The one other like little agenda item I had for the schema coordinate spec is, and maybe we just kind of like discuss this next time, but what generally happens when like a new thing happens in the GraphQL language or the spec? Like, does it just quietly get added to the schema and people have to like know about it, or like is there a Twitter account that you know? Like I don't know how like to tell people about this basically. like there might be some library authors who would care about this.
Oh, this is a great question. So we have a GraphQL marketing committee now, which is just a couple of people from the board who control the Twitter account. But what we've done in the past that I actually think has worked out pretty well is encourage the spec champions to write a blog post or sort of whatever form is most reasonable, and then have a lot of folks kind of share that out. That way you kind of get the credit for putting the work into this. You can kind of write the blog post explaining it and what it's for and why it's useful and how it works and any of the backstory or whatever will make a good blog post. And we can tweet that from the GraphQL Twitter account and send it around in all the places you want to send it around. So that's one that I think that's the most useful one for sort of real time as things get approved and added to the spec, then these blog posts can come out. And then as you showed up late, but Brian was here earlier describing the kind of last phase of the process to ratify the spec. There's some sort of legal mumbo jumbo that we got to get through. But once we've done that, another piece will be sort of like a fully formed change log of like, here's everything that happened between the last official cut of the release.
Awesome, thanks. So just before we move on then, like open question to people here, does anyone have any lingering items they want to discuss with the spec in its current form before I go off and start writing unit tests?
One actually, like, please suggested about this function. I think it's actually the most useful function. You give a schema coordinate and a schema and you receive an object. Problem with that, like, you don't know what you receive. So a new value and argument, like it just like object with properties. So we basically need to return like type of the thing. Is it argument? Is it a new value? Is it and the thing itself? So a question, and I also thought about another function that you give schema coordinate and it's return what it points to. So is it like a type? So type is valid schema coordinate, right? Just a type name, it's shortest form. So you can distinguish a type, you can distinguish a directive, you can distinguish argument inside the field. But if it's type name dot field type name dot something, you don't know, is it like a field name, is it like a new value, is it like, so we kind of have unique shapes for every target. So for argument we have unique shape, for type we have unique shape, and for directive we have unique shape. But if it's just a type name dot something, it can be a new value, union type, or field. So
interface.
Or interface, yeah. So like maybe I'm not sure, but maybe it's useful property to know what a thing points to even before looking into a schema, because we like almost have this. So like I need to think about this. And actually, like I like Lee's suggestion to start with utility function. I think like let's review utility function and figure out maybe we need to adjust something into.
This is part of the reason why I like the process of writing reference implementation at the same time as writing the spec text. Is it helps you think through these things with real code. You can throw unit tests at them in a way that helps you look for edge cases. It actually, I'm coming around. I still won't block RC2 on it, but I think it'll actually be really useful to just kind of gut check the logic that's written for the semantics, because I mean, it's not huge, but there's a good couple dozen lines of semantics there. And those semantics would basically like literally almost be line for line. Like you could just like copy that out, put it in as comments, and like start filling in the implementation. And you'll probably find there's a one-to-one match. And if you do that and you realize like, oh crap, there's some edge case that we missed that I need to do in order to find this one particular thing. Or hey, the way we phrase that is actually like really weird. It doesn't match the kind of code you'd have to write. And we should kind of refine that. Those are the kinds of like really nice things that you get out of writing reference implementation at the same time as the spec text. But what Yvonne's suggesting is probably also like in the realm of implementation detail. I think, and you'll probably figure that out if you start kind of writing some code here, like how much of this is, oh, this is a JavaScriptism, like I need to return back the type of the thing in addition to the thing itself. Whereas if this was Ruby, then maybe you wouldn't do that because you could just kind of like check to see what type of the thing it is itself because it's a Ruby object. So probably a good thing to keep in mind for the JavaScript specific implementation. Yvonne's bringing up some great points. I'll let you guys take that to the PR discussion thread when inevitably arrives. But yeah, this is the good stuff that you'll probably deduce from writing some code.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Cool. And before we move on, this is related but slightly off topic. One of the things that we've been talking about with the schema coordinates is potentially expanding them and what other use cases are. So I just wanted to raise that I've been talking with Danielle Mann from the Apollo team, and we were discussing different ways that it could be used. One, and I just wanted to highlight this comment that I have on the pull request 746. But basically, there's a few different ways that Apollo use paths that are like this already. They're normally doing it in HTML, obviously, so they have like the different types that are clickable with an arrow between them. But I quite like the idea of using the greater than symbol to say, like, you know, follow this path. We might go with more of a dash greater than or something, but we can use it for things like indicating what the history is through the graphical documentation sidebar, for example. So that way you could permalink an entire stack of documentation. You could also use it like when you're deprecating a field, maybe you deprecate a root level field and say, instead, you should request it through this path through the GraphQL schema. So that's another idea. And we could have graphical automatically even expand that for you potentially. There's also ideas of linking between documentation of various things and showing where particular fields and types can be accessed from, and we could even use it for things like tracking like usage counters of various parts of the schema. So this is all things that extensions of the schema coordinates RFC could be used for. If people have more ideas of where this could be used, now would be the time to raise them so that we make sure that whatever syntax we use in schema coordinates is useful for these other purposes. And if it's not, that isn't a problem and it shouldn't stop schema coordinates, but it does help us to decide between, for example, doing the query.business.id versus the query.business parenthesis ID. That's what I wanted to say on that.
Which of these GitHub issues is the best place to leave that sort of feedback?
I think probably the RFC that Benji was just looking at, because that's where the theoretical discussion of the syntax has mostly been taking place. But I'm wondering if it makes sense to start like a new place to talk about schema coordinates 2.0 or whatever the syntax is, to avoid, you know, riders on my bill, basically. It's like I assume it's going to be like a separate spec proposal. But obviously, as Benji says, there might be some semantics of the future imagined 2.0 thing that changes the syntax we have as the current spec. So yeah, I think keeping it in the RFC proposal sounds good. But I'll let Benji decide because he proposed this.
I'm happy with it just going on in the RFC proposal for now. I think that's fine. Should it be the issue or the pull request?
Oh yeah, I was going to say probably the issue, because that's where the majority of the discussion around this has taken place already.
That 746, that one.
It's fine for that to happen there. This is one of my gripes with GitHub, is that it's oftentimes hard to find active discussion on PRs that have been merged. So barring anywhere else, this is a fine place to continue discussion. If there's a specific topic you want to dive into deeper, which is how schema coordinates could evolve, then maybe it's worth opening a new issue and just kind of referring to these things. That way we have a non-closed place to continue discussion. I won't be picky about that, but just something to be worried about.
I just wanted to provide some examples where I think this would be useful for us. And indeed, as a preview, we have a way to track usage of different schema elements to support deprecations, and this would have been fantastic.
That's great. And Evan, I know you've got opinions too about advanced paths into the schema as opposed to just coordinate.
Yeah, we have like Mike, we have paths internally and as part of our public tooling now for informing clients about deprecated API usage.
One suggestion before we for marks, because I don't know if I can find you outside of this group. So when you will work on PR for GraphQL.js, can you please open RFC PR? So because like we're not sure like what utility function we'll add and how it will look like. So if you open RFC PR and do it incrementally, I can give you it will prevent the situation.
Sorry, your microphone's cutting out there. And also, I think I can hear Benji maybe typing.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mute.
Sorry, it's okay. Sorry, Ivan, let me just confirm, because your microphone was cutting in and out. Are you saying that you want me to open an RFC for the utility function specifically to sort of sketch them out?
Yeah. So my suggestion for you is to not to like work on it for continuously for a couple of weeks, and when you open a PR and we end up like rewriting half of it.
Okay.
Like let's if you can open PR, RFC PR and do it like kind of development publicly, I will try to give feedback earlier.
Oh, sure.
So
you just want me to like commit everything and just like have a stream of updates. Yeah. That makes sense. I also wonder if there's like, I don't know, like a code sandbox or something way of like forking GraphQL.js and whatever. I take your suggestion. I'll just commit everything so that we can like review it line by line as we're going forward. That sounds good.
Yeah, and if you need some like help or anything, you can reach me on Slack. I'm like, I will write in chat my name in GraphQL Slack. It's basically.
Oh yeah, thanks. In the GraphQL.slack.com thing.
You can reach me there, and
okay.
Like we can even like schedule a call or something if it would be like particular complicated problem. It's just like I'm personally not sure what to put with utility function or how to name this thing or how function should look like. That's why like I'm like suggesting making it iteratively and save us time on back and forth.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, thanks. We'll do the mind meld required then for this, and we'll try and get something out. Appreciate it. And yeah, thanks again to Benji in particular and everyone else who has helped with this and push this along. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your hard work on this. Okay, we've bounced around the agenda a bit. I think we have one left, which is query ambiguity. Benji.
I was going to say, I'm happy to punt this to next month if you want. Basically, this is, I did a big topic on query ambiguity before, and I basically made all of the spec edits I possibly could so that we could see which ones would make the most sense. I think consistently, one of the issues that I found is the use of the term query error in the spec, where the error can happen in a mutation or in a subscription as well as a query, but it can also just happen as part of validation of the operation document itself, which again we call query. So it's the use of this word query to describe so many different things. It makes the text less clear what we're referring to. We do, I believe, have the concept of a GraphQL request, which is where we actually issue to the GraphQL function. Here is the schema, here is the document, here are the variables, here's the context. Go and do the thing. I believe we call that a request. So I'm suggesting that we rename query error to request error. This may not be sufficient in itself. We might want to actually go through and rewrite a few other things to use the word request rather than query. But we can pull that from the original thing. I just wanted to test the water before I put any more time in here to see what people's general thoughts were on this.
It makes sense to me. I might do an annoying thing and suggest that while we've opened the can of worms, we should look at how we describe errors in general. This is kind of related to the idea of a glossary, which I know we have an open action item to investigate. But I think maybe what we're missing is, barring having a full glossary, just like literally one place where we say in GraphQL, there's two different kinds of errors that we describe, and here's what we call them. So just like a mini glossary specific to the various kinds of errors, because we also have validation errors and field errors, and they all kind of have slightly different behavior. So if there's a place where we can kind of describe all of them, then as part of this change, I think will be a double whammy. But in terms of the renaming, this makes complete sense to me.
I'm going to have to watch that back in the Zoom recording because I'm trying to write it down whilst also listening, and I missed a little bit of it, I'm afraid. But yes, that sounds desirable, and I imagine there's going to be a whole bunch of those as I try and solve query ambiguity. So I should prepare myself very well.
That's really my only piece of feedback on this, is that changing it from query error to response error sure seems like a pure win to me, but we don't do a very good job at a very high level describing what errors are, and we should probably do that too. I'm happy to help with that, but if you want to take a crack at it as part of this, then that would be great.
Would it make sense to do it just as a separate thing? Try and keep things small and easy to advance?
It could. I'd like us to, I'm going to tag up this to be stage 1 RFC, just because I think everyone, this is clearly an extension of the thing you brought up before of the query ambiguity that we all agreed was a problem we're solving. So I think that qualifies it for stage 1. I would at least like us to investigate it. If it's going to end up being like a pretty major complicated change to overhaul how we describe errors, then I'm totally on board with it being a follow-on separate RFC. But if it ends up being actually kind of small and it's just a way to describe what a response error is somewhere before we refer to it all the time, then maybe that's like just a nice kind of editorial improvement to this. Evan, can you describe out loud what you typed in the chat?
Sure, yeah. So a lot of schemas have like an error type in the schema, an object type that is returned from mutations for things that are not like at the GraphQL layer, but are like, you know, some business validation failed or something like that. And I've seen like everybody calls them something slightly different. So if we're going to be clarifying errors, we should say like, oh, by the way, if you have errors in your schema, they can be called this as like a non-normative note, and at least start putting people on the same page of that. Because it seems to be a pretty common pattern, but everybody does it differently. Sorry, I know that's like piling on to the like random additional work that Benji didn't really sign up for here. But if we're doing errors, that's a thing that bugs me about errors.
That one does seem maybe tangential enough that it deserves its own RC. But I'm all for listing all of our gripes with errors. We can improve them. I think the spec could be much more clear about how we talk about errors.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting idea, Ivan. There's a real mixture of opinions in what I've seen about how you would model errors as part of, for example, unions on the payload types of mutations and things like that. But I don't think, in my opinion, I don't think as an ecosystem we've got to a point where that's sufficiently advanced that we've determined what that non-normative note in the spec would be about that. So I do think it's probably out of scope for this, but I'm certainly interested to see what that would be.
So I have a little bit context on this because I mentored Caroline for Google Season of Docs, and she collected a bunch of questions that community have, and this was one of the questions: how to do validation errors. So yeah, it's definitely not part of Benji's effort to clarify word query, but as encouragement, if somebody is interested in clarifying this, non-normative nodes can look like our errors are intended to like unexpected errors, and if some errors are part of your domain and you have like a field and you want to have some selection on them, you should define them in schema. Even that sentence will clarify things for a bunch of people, because right now they're like wondering why we don't have types for errors and why you cannot predict error content and stuff like that. So definitely not part of like Benji's effort, but if somebody else willing to do, it's like important question for community. Not to go on like on a site how you should do that, like unions or interface or something else, but just to say like, we know this is an issue. We know that like if errors is part of your domain, you should define them in schema, not rely on error mechanism from GraphQL.
We have some internal docs on this that I can probably tidy up and share. I don't think there's much like really that's Shopify specific about them. I don't really know where to share them to.
We have
a random GitHub issue seems a bit.
We have frequently asked question, and Caroline left it in a nice shape after Go Season of Docs. So on GraphQL.org, we have like frequently asked questions section, and like it's not for long answers, but if you're interested, you can submit answers there, clarifying situation with errors and provide useful.
I mean, this is just, I don't think it's appropriate for that because it's a pretty opinionated about like, this is how we do it at Shopify, rather than like here are all of the general best practices. But
you could, if you just want it for this audience, you could share it in Slack.
That's a good, yeah, I'll put it into a gist or something and share it in Slack.
All right. I think we have next steps on this one, Benji. Is that right? We're gonna do a little investigation on having somewhere where we just like basically the first place where we say response error. We just kind of describe what that thing is. But otherwise, this change looks really good. So stage one, at least. We'll go from there.
Cool. Sounds good.
I'm on our agenda.
Yeah, I've got to run now, but I think we are done the agenda anyways. So have a great day, everybody.
For everybody, thanks everyone for coming. We got through a lot today, so thank you. And look forward to seeing everybody next month.
Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.